If you looked at it in isolation without any of the backstory, you might think, sounds like you're talking about access. More kids were identified and connected to intervention. Yes, that is true. And guess what? You can't benefit from an intervention that you don't receive. So the first step is identifying kids who have additional need and connecting them to appropriate intervention. So again, if you compared across the 3 study conditions, those in the ISF did have more students who were proactively connected to appropriate intervention. And if you look at the 3rd bullet point, we had a sub-study on students who were Black and of color, because in the southeast of our country, disproportionality, it's like a funnel. The schools with the highest rates of disproportionate discipline are located in the southeast of our country. So we were trying to tease out if we can identify students of color who might be at risk and benefit from higher levels of intervention, are they less likely to end up having discipline infractions and be suspended? And so not only were we able to connect them to appropriate intervention, but also here on the next slide, you will see that we did reduce both out-of-school suspensions and office discipline referrals for students of color in the ISF condition and in comparison to the other 2 conditions. But again, reductions in suspensions and ODRs overall as well. I also want to show you just one example of what I mean by progress monitoring individual and group interventions for students. All right. In this example, what you're looking at is a graph that was came out of the school's database. So they had a database where they were tracking other types of things for kids. And the clinician hired by the agency was entering progress monitoring data into the system. Now, in case you don't know, having anyone outside of a school system use a school district's database practically takes an act of Congress. And so because they had the leadership with authority to make decisions, they were able to get these clinicians access to the database so that they could do things like you see here. And so this is a kid who was having some issues with self-regulation. And one of the data points was attendance. They were not coming to school. They were coming to school late. They were leaving early. So issues around attendance. And so that was one data point that they monitored while the student was meeting with the clinician, learning some new skills around emotional regulation and management. And so you can see while they were in the intervention, their attendance improved, right? So it doesn't have to be tricky or complicated or complex. What are the presenting problems? Why are kids being identified as needing additional support? Those are the data points to monitor. A couple of other things about the study. This study ended quite a bit ago. It takes quite a while to mull through all of that data, and there will be several other outputs in terms of outcomes that are going to come from the results. And we have had some subsequent studies become funded. That includes one using interconnected systems framework and some work around deliberately addressing disproportionality and discipline by also, first of all, looking at it, talking about it, and then teaching things like implicit bias training for adults and students, creating school environments that are culturally responsive. And once discipline disproportionality is identified, teaching neutralizing routines so that we can, again, try to be proactive and address those types of issues. We also have another study in 2 different districts, again, just kind of based on some of our learning to continue to test and learn from these experiences, as well as some model demonstrations that have recently been funded and some other ones that we're doing from our center. So my point here is to say that the research is emerging around aligned and integrated systems, and we're putting it into practice regardless, learning from the experiences in real world settings, and then taking that learning in an iterative continuous quality improvement process. All right, so let's talk about some strategies and recommendations and things that you might consider after you are finished with your couple of days here of being in a room with other people, learning and sharing together. P.S. I've decided already, my feet hurt. Who else has not worn heels in a really long time, right? All right, I'm glad everybody's still with me out there. Okay, big idea here is that if we want schools to be successful with this work, they need to be supported by district and community leadership teams. That's those people with authority to make decisions. And if those folks are struggling with, we've got a barrier with funding or a barrier with policy or a barrier with whatever it is, we need to kind of kick it up to a higher level. And that's where your AEAs come in. As you heard this morning, there are some AEAs in this state that I know are working on aligning and integrating their efforts and have formed a regional leadership team and are using instruments like a systems fidelity inventory to make an action plan to support SEBH in their districts and providing those districts with coaching and training and technical assistance. And then it kind of goes down the cascade. And furthermore, if the AEA can't solve it, we got to kick it up a notch to the state level, right? Your state Department of Education, your behavioral health entities, Iowa's Center for School Mental Health, the Please Pass the Love folks, we've all got to coalesce around this work in order to help schools support their kids and families. And so if you're interested in more about the idea of implementation science or, what are the kinds of questions you should be asking or the ways in which you go about setting up an action plan, we use the logic from the PBIS implementation blueprint because, again, we have data and evidence to say for almost 25 years, when done well, this MTSS works. It helps kids, it helps adults. And so those leadership teams have to focus on both the executive functions and the implementation functions of the work. And we know that schools aren't going to be able to do it without that leadership, right? Just like I hope you wouldn't have schools on their own decide what should our math curriculum be this year, right? That's a district level decision. The same should be true around decisions that are made for SEBH, right? If you want to use a universal screener and you're not already doing so, that's not something you want each school to figure out on their own. There are legal and ethical implications that need to be decided at the district level, right? And so we have some instruments. This here is a snapshot from the district system fidelity inventory, focused on that executive function around funding and alignment that offers some thinking around what's the strategic plan? How do you assess your current initiatives, programs, and practices and find those opportunities for alignment, integration, or even elimination? And so we have some steps for alignment. In fact, there's a technical assistance brief on this if you're interested in it. And I know that some of you already are prioritizing SEBH as one of your strategic goals. And with our friends in implementation science, this is where we have to say, do we want to do it? Or are we required to? But even if required, how can we make sure that we're taking into context our local school community and making decisions that are going to work to fit your situation, right? And again, this is a process. In fact, if you are in a district where you have more than 2 schools, let's say, you want to try some things out in one building first before you go district-wide, because there will be bumps in the road and there will be barriers and there will be kinks to work out. And you want to do that before people say, oh, see, we tried that and that didn't work. And then you can kind of keep with your continuous quality improvement and take it to other places. And so you might want to make some decisions around exploring, if someone says, oh, I think we should do X or Y or Z, your first reaction or response should be, hold up, let's see if this is something we should do right now. And this might not be the time to add more things, right? And then you've got to decide, do we have people in position with authority? Are we willing to commit to this for 3, 5, 10 years? What will need to take place in order to do it well? And so there is some guidance, there are documents, we have a manual on steps for exploration, adoption, and initial installation. It is helpful if you can have someone help you facilitate the process. So for districts, that might be someone from your AEA. But the big idea is we've got to have a framework, that multi-tiered system of support using those core features. And right now, what we know is there are no quick fixes. Now, as Dr. Bradley said this morning, there is new funding right now, and that can be a blessing and also a curse. And that's true even if you have a grant, because the urge is to say, let's hire more people. A couple of things about that. First of all, I don't think anyone would argue we definitely need more people, right? And yet people alone are not going to solve it. We have to rely on the system. We have to change the system. And simply buying new curriculum will not in and of itself fix it or solve it. We have to make sure it's something that's going to match our need. And we have to make sure we have people in position in order to implement it, right? So for example, if you're going to use an SEL curriculum, you want to decide who's going to teach these lessons. Is it going to be the classroom teacher? And if so, what are they not going to do so that they can do this? Or how are we going to weave it into the academic curriculum? Training staff on things like trauma-informed care, that's really great. No one would argue that it's not needed. And in and of itself is insufficient. We have to ensure that we're following up and following through so that what's learned in training is going to be put into practice into the classroom. You know, what we know from Joyce and Showers is that even today, you're going to remember like 10% maybe of what you heard in terms of messages. And so unless someone is following up and following through, how will this change your practice in a few days or next week or next month? So the big idea today and tomorrow, yesterday, mental health is everyone's job. And that includes families, administrators, our support services. I'm hearing custodians are subbing in classrooms in addition to all the other things that they're doing. How do we make sure people are equipped so that they have skills to care for themselves as well as others? And how do we start to move towards ensuring that our SEBH competencies are in everything that we do? We've got to break down our silos, increase confidence and competence. And in order to do that, we've got to be able to get back to basics, right? So as people have returned to school, and when I say that term, it's, you know, loosely defined. I know that last year, some people were remote all year, some were hybrid, some were in person most of the year. Maybe some kids were still remote. I feel like that could change, you know, at any time in lots of places. And by the way, that might be related to COVID-19, but it can also be other things. My kids missed a day and a half of school in September because Hurricane Ida went through, and we live in South Central Pennsylvania. So, you know, you never know what's coming in terms of the needs for us to be even more flexible in the way in which we provide education to kids. So as you look at this list, the fact of the matter is these are probably things that you all already knew, right? And so if these things are not new to us, how do we prioritize getting back to the basics and again, doing a few things, doing them really well. And that starts with investing in a culture of wellness across our implementation cascade. So that's state to AEA to district to school, right? Again, there are some guidance documents available at pbis.org if you have not seen them. I think that document from the US DOE that just came out that I shared early on and Renee shared this morning has even more expanded language and recommendations than these early documents. But the ideas, are right there in terms of we've got to help kids be reacquainted with us. We've got to get to know kids again. And for some kids, these last year and a half has maybe been better for them. And for some, it's been worse. Family members have lost jobs or they've lost loved ones. And so we've got to get to know kids and families again. I think if the last 19 months have taught us anything, it's that we certainly need family school community partnerships. Now more than ever, that's very critical. Reteaching, reminding, reinforcing both with behavior specific praise and also error correction and feedback of expectations, rules, routines, procedures. All of those are really important right now. Also, looking for signs that kids need more help. So we've talked a lot about data. I've shared with you different considerations for that. Use your gut in addition, right? How are kids presenting when they come to school? Are there kids that you're worried about? How can you make sure you're letting someone know about that? And then finding ways to connect them. And there are going to be different phases of recovery. And maybe we're going to make 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. It's hard to tell, and time will certainly let us know. If you look at this online, you will find lots of hyperlinks for other types of resources and strategies. If you're interested in bolstering what you're doing around staff wellness, or thinking about how to better connect with families and authentically engage them in their child's education, or informing them more about mental health and things like that. So I'm just going to go through here a few pieces about doing what works, getting back to basics. And, one of those is connect. And that's where we want to start, right? Relationships, relationships, relationships. That's among adults in your school systems, adult to student, student to student, and everyone connecting with family, all right? And so it also means all environments, right? Whether that's if kids are virtual or hybrid or in person, if they're spending time on the bus, which again, I'm hearing in lots of places, kids are on the bus even longer because there's a shortage of bus drivers and therefore there's less bus routes and kids are on them like forever, right? So that's going to be another place where we might need to give some support. Screening. Again, if you already, how many of you are, by show of hands, using a universal screener? And maybe people virtually, you could type in the chat, yes or no, if you're screening. Okay. How about virtually? Can we hear anybody saying yes? Some are. All right, great. So that is one way for us to survey or try to uncover kids with additional need. Certainly, we want to use that data with other data. And if you're not using a universal screener, what are the ways that you can get at that same information? Can you ask kids informally? Can you ask families informally? Can you ask teachers? Give me the top 3 kids you're worried about in your classroom right now and why, right? How can you uncover need? Maybe it's some of those other data points. What about kids who go to the nurse? If you don't have a nurse, that they go to the office, or kids who can't be in the classroom because they're not able to regulate emotions or ask to see the counselor, right? That's data. And you want to figure out how many kids are in those situations, how much lost instruction is there, And what do you think you need to do to address the need? Is it a few kids, a lot of kids, all kids, right? You got to kind of wrap your arms around that and then decide what you're going to do about it, right? Sometimes the kids who are kind of percolating to the top are already on your radar and they're already in an intervention. But some kids are going to be unknown to your team, and you're going to need to think about how you're going to respond. When we're supporting, guess what? We're going to need to do some things at tier 1 that we used to only do at tiers 2 and 3, right? We've got to drop down our supports, which means things like not only teaching routines and procedures, but also pro-social skills, coping skills, problem-solving strategies. It's going to be really critical that adults have those skills or can be taught them as well so that they can model, teach, and practice. It's really important that we talk out loud with kids about it so that they don't see us as not ever having any struggles. So it's okay to say things to kids like, I'm frustrated because my alarm didn't go off this morning and I was a few minutes late to school. Or I'm feeling upset today because my aunt is ill and she had to be hospitalized, or whatever it is, right? Guess what? Teachers are people too. One of my kids said that once when they were little, but it's true. And so let's be humans and let's not only name it, but also teach what we can do about it. And so that's that piece about saying, I feel frustrated and I'm going to, take a deep breath. Who wants to do it with me, kids? And having a technique to teach kids that skill and prompt them. Oh, you know what? Betsy, looks like you're starting to, become frustrated. Why don't you use your strategy? Remember, smell the soup, cool the soup, which is that inhale, exhale. Okay. So how do we teach, practice, and model for kids these kinds of skills? Okay. There's a question.
It's anonymous, so I'm not sure who it is, but they're asking about using the acronym SEB versus SEBMH. Curious if that's a potential difference.
Great question. All right, so I have to repeat the question. The question is, why is the acronym SEB instead of SEBH on many of my slides, SEBMH? I should have given my disclaimer at the start, which is, first of all, there are lots of acronyms, right? And I do sometimes use them all interchangeably. And again, you have to decide for your context, which I know in Iowa you use SEBH. That's okay. The big idea is that we're not talking about any one of those things, right? That it's social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health. And you need to use the words that work for you. And I guess maybe unlike me at the beginning, I would encourage you to make sure you explain that to all the adults in your system. That includes families, so that there isn't confusion. I've been in districts where, frankly, sometimes the same acronym means something different in one place compared to another. And if people don't get clear about what it is they're talking about, they might not be having the same conversation. Any other questions? All right. Yeah, sure. Thank you. All right. So I've been talking about teaching skills, and we have to be deliberate. And again, we might need to be thinking about if you used to provide let's see, some sort of intervention to address anxiety or depression or the impact of trauma, and that was only like in small groups or individual intervention, that might be something you need to do in all your classrooms in your school now. So tier 1 intervention, okay? Because again, what we know is the prevalence is there. And frankly, what we're learning is we've really all been through a collective trauma, and it is impacting our brains. And we do need to pay attention to what that means. And therefore, we would all benefit from being mindful and having the opportunity to practice using some good strategies to help promote and foster resiliency and build those protective factors. And then we have to monitor, right? What are we learning about our data? What are we learning about the impact? Depending on your presenting problem. So like you saw in the one example, is it going to be attendance you're going to monitor? Is it time out of class? Is it acting out behaviors? Is it internalizing issues, kids who are withdrawn, or maybe, having episodes of crying? Whatever it is, you want to monitor that through your single system of delivery. And again, if you have kids who aren't with you in person, you've got to find the way that you're going to be able to do that when they're remote. All right, I'm going to talk about now kind of an example of how to do this using SEL. So keep in mind, no matter your related initiative, the same logic applies, but this is the one I'm going to show you now. So again, there's this technical assistance brief. In it, you would find this example. Again, for schools who implement PBIS or maybe did in the past, early on, teams are taught to come up with 3 to 5 expectations and then specific procedures and routines in all settings of the school. And by the way, schools get really clever and creative with the kinds of things that they come up with and the ways in which they teach it. You can find videos online that will make you giggle, but also give you ideas for how to do the same in your school. And again, since the 90s, this is the way it was taught. And it works really well. Those routines and procedures are no longer sufficient. They're important. And frankly, probably when we needed to keep social distancing helped, especially for things like, only walk in a single file line down this side of the hallway, or only use that hallway to go this way, or that stairwell to go up, or whatever it is. But now we have to build in the pro-social skills, the coping skills, and the problem-solving strategies. And so you can see here as an example, and they're in italics, some of those skills. And in this instance, they also have a whole column for online. By the way, this example was made prior to COVID-19. And frankly, kind of gets at that piece about how, whether we're talking about kids or adults, it's a good idea to do things like consider the feelings of others before posting something or sending an email. Maybe if you're angry, wait a day. Checking your feelings. Doing things like double checking your sources. Is something true that I'm about to share? And then look at in the lunchroom. Now, again, lunchrooms have changed, right? Before COVID, I used to say things like, well, they're loud. There's lots of people. They smell weird. They probably smell weird still. I haven't been in a school cafeteria in a couple of school years, right? But then for a while, they kind of seemed like they were sad and lonely, like kids had to sit far apart, and some schools use plexiglass to put in between kids so they couldn't really even talk to each other. And it just kind of felt isolating and lonely at a time when kids had an opportunity to kind of have a break and do a little socializing. Nevertheless, what are the skills that need to be taught to help kids navigate those scenarios? And so this is just one example. There's lots available. And I want you to think about in your districts and schools, do you use some sort of SEL curriculum? It's okay if you do. And the things you need to think about are who teaches the lessons? Is there someone like a counselor who goes classroom to classroom and gives the lesson while the teacher sits at their desk or leaves the room entirely? Do you start with lesson 1 and just go through the curriculum? Or do you say, based on our data, it looks like we need to go to lesson 17 first, right? So it's really important to think about what is it that you're doing right now. This slide has pictures on it that I took while I took a team of teachers on a field trip in their own school. And what you can see is they were implementing PBIS. So they had their matrices both in the hallway and also in their classrooms. They had a bully prevention program. So one of the posters is from that. They used a social skill curriculum. One of the posters is from that. And then teachers all had their own classroom management strategies. It was not the same in all the classrooms. And you can see, and by the way, it's a great group of people, great school, well-intentioned, And on these posters, there are similar but different words. And so I said to them, when something happens, which words do you use? Which poster do you point to? And it was like literally, I saw light bulbs go off above their heads. And they recognized that they were doing really great things and it wasn't connected. They had someone come in to teach the social skill lesson. The teacher didn't even know what the lessons were or what words to use. Guess what? There will not be transference and generalization of skills into the classroom if the teacher isn't involved in the teaching, right? If they're going to do that, something else has to stop, right? For classroom management strategies, some of them used, I hate to even say it out loud, clip charts. And I talked with them about how that's really not a best practice. And they said, okay, we're willing to change, but tell us what to do, right? That's where not only training, but also coaching and technical assistance comes into play. Because frankly, by the time we were done with the conversation, most of them admitted that they probably weren't even using whatever strategy they had for classroom management to fidelity, whatever that means, or in a consistent way. And so they were willing to make changes. It took time. And frankly, it takes decision makers, right? We've got to free up teachers if they're going to teach social emotional competencies, or find the places in the curriculum where that's going to fit. You know, so can time be set aside in the elementary school or weave it into language arts or social studies? At the secondary level, do all kids have health class and should it be there? Or again, should it be into all of the general curriculum? But the big idea is that we're not going to move the needle if we're kind of bits and pieces and part and parcel and separated in our efforts. And so if we go back to our core features and think about some of the things that I asked you to be cautious about, if you're going to hire more people, get them on teams. Make sure that if it's a clinical person, you're using them to consult with teachers and teach teachers and build the capacity of your staff. If you're going to use an SEL curriculum, make sure that data is guiding the decisions you make about what lessons are taught, to whom, how frequently, and if you need to dose it up, which means reteach lessons to kids in small groups or individually. If you're going to train teachers in things like trauma-informed practices, then embed that new learning, support teachers to actually change their practice, and find ways to partner with families. Schools tell me all the time how hard this is, right? We can't have families on our team because we got a lot going on and we're really not ready to share that with families. It's kind of like we want to fix things inside before we invite families to the table. Well, guess what? Families don't have it figured out either all the way, right? So let's all be vulnerable and professional and get families to tell us their perception, their perspective, and help us with decision making, because that's what's really going to move the needle. And families don't like to share some things with the school either. So how do we help them feel like it's a safe place? And that if they tell us about a concern for their child, that we're going to help them solve problems, as opposed to families worry that it's going to cause their child to be labeled or picked on or punished in some way. And so we have to find the ways to use our multi-tiered system of support to build that family school community partnership and all of the things that I've been saying throughout this talk today. What are some of the other community data points? I mentioned some of the school ones. Again, some of these things may have changed in some of your communities in the last little bit of time, but you've got to find out what families are connected to formal serving systems, justice, child welfare? Are there more families who are insecure with food or at risk of losing their housing? What about employment based on factors over the last year and a half? Are there families who are taking kids to the emergency room for mental health crises? You should be able to get your hands on that kind of a data. And then that will help you decide what are you going to do across your continuum of interventions. And when and where and how do you need to teach things for all kids, some kids, and a few kids? And how do you move beyond whatever your school rules or expectations are to teaching some of those other types of skills, which again, when done well, is really how we help kids become healthy, successful, productive adults and members of our communities. And so these are just a few examples here about other types of skills to teach. So you don't have to purchase a curriculum. You can think about what is your data telling you and how do you know when you need to teach some skills. So, there are lots of kind of campaigns or initiatives about being kind and reducing stigma and stopping bullying and things like that. Those might be some skills to consider. Make sure you're customizing. Again, please don't leave here and, take one curriculum that someone else is using and say, the neighboring district is doing this, I think we should do it as well, right? All school communities are different, and it's important for you to examine what the options are based on your context and pick something that's going to fit good for you. And then find opportunities. When kids come back to school, we're getting close to the holidays. There's going to be some time away. What about when they come back in January? What about if you have to transition and go to remote learning again? When are the opportunities for you to boost and, again, think about getting back to the basics, right? And so, again, I want to point you to some resources, and then I believe I am supposed to leave some time at the end for questions. So there are tools that can help you with your action planning. I know that, just like there's initiative overload, there is tool overload. So if you already have some tools that you use and they're working for you, you don't have to add another one. That said, for the sake of action planning, if you're interested in bolstering what you're doing around SEBH, there are some things that might be helpful to you. As I mentioned, not only do we have those technical assistance briefs, which again are meant to be short and simple and sweet, we have entire ebooks like this, the Implementation Guide for Interconnected Systems Framework. You can find all of the chapters as well as an implementation guide with links to other tools and activities that you can do. Works best when facilitated with someone who's outside of your district, a coach or TA provider. If you don't have time to read an entire manual, we have a 4-minute video that you might take and share with other stakeholders to say, this is something we might need to consider in our work. I think there's also an 8-minute video. Again, you can find all of these things at pbis.org. And you should have access to the PowerPoint so that you can refer back to the resources later. Oh, no, I don't want to play this movie right now. Hold on. Shoot. I hope this is going to cooperate with me. Okay, and there are a few fact sheets. We intended these to be like 1-pagers, and they're probably each maybe 3 or 4 pages. But again, short and to the point. If you need to go back to an administrator, like maybe you heard some nuggets today and you're thinking, okay, but I need my superintendent, building principal, agency executive director, whomever those people are that are going to make decisions, you can take these things back to them. And, hopefully, because of the priorities that you all have, you'll be able to move the needle a little bit. Again, it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight, and keep at it, right? Make an action plan that has 3 things on it. By the end of this school year, we want to do this, that, and the other thing, and that's it. And maybe it's Examine all of your initiatives and teams and find opportunities for alignment and integration. Maybe it's examine a universal screener if you're not already using one to get started with it next school year. Whatever it is, big or small, you all are definitely on the right path for making an impact for your kids and families because of the fact that you're here and you're committed to this work. And so with that, I think we have just under 10 minutes. And so I want to give an opportunity for some questions and dialogue from those of you in the room, as well as those of you joining us online. I still see eyeballs, so people are not asleep. So that's good news. Any questions? None coming in chat? Okay. Yes, sir. HIPAA? Mhm. 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 The question is about HIPAA, which is the law for providers around addressing confidentiality and keeping private health information protected. Along with that, these are my words, not yours, is FERPA, which is the educational law that gives guidance to school entities around protected information for students, student records. Thank you. I've not ever given a talk on this topic without confidentiality coming up. In fact, we're in the process of writing one of those TA briefs on this topic. And it, you know what, here's the truth is I'm going to give you an answer that I feel like is pretty straightforward. Putting it in writing is really hard. And the reason is the laws are complicated. There is a joint guide for HIPAA and FERPA and kind of how they work together. Things that can and can't be shared, or frankly, at the end of the day, if you're doing what's in the best interest of students on the education side and clients on the mental behavioral health side, then, you know, here's the bottom line. One, we should inform and involve families in every decision we make. If we are including and involving families, they will be giving their consent all along the way because they're part of our decision making. Right? That's the first thing. Second, you know, in addition to laws, there are ethical guidelines from our professional organizations. There are policies that states and districts have in place, as well as organizations have policies. The policies, if you read them and you look at them, and the ethics, it's all pretty muddy and murky when we try to put it into practice. But the bottom line is this, that district community leadership team should make decisions about how information will be shared. And it should be about skills and data and progress monitoring and things like that. We don't need a team of people looking at data or making decisions to know about the nitty gritty details of what a child or family shares about their personal business. That's not what's important. We don't need to know about those kinds of details. What we do need to know is what's the presenting problem? What data point are we going to monitor? What skills are going to be taught in the intervention? So we don't need clinicians to share about what kids are saying. We need whoever is facilitating the intervention to say, I'm teaching these two coping techniques and this problem solving skill. And so if we have shared agreements that should be in writing, by the way, memorandum of understanding, policies, et cetera, if we're including and involving families, and if we're sticking to what needs to be discussed, not what people are curious about, then we will be adhering to protecting private information and respecting confidentiality, our ethics and the law, and at the same time, not hiding behind it as a reason that we're not sharing, and then kids don't get the help they need. So we can't allow it to become a barrier. We've got to address it. Thank you. Anything else? Mm-hmm.
You talked a little bit about, following fidelity, the examples of like, say there's a seemingly.
Mhm.
But then also on the other side, the customization, different. Where is that line? What do you give advice to schools as far as you've customized it so much, now it's no longer fidelity?
Okay.
Advice.
The question is about fidelity, and I'm going to paraphrase. I think you're really speaking about system fidelity, and you mentioned PBIS, and then there's also intervention fidelity, right? So system fidelity, we have instruments for that, right? So schools use something like the tiered fidelity inventory, which is a validated measure of fidelity. There's also one for ISF implementation inventory, that measures reliably and valid alignment and integration of the systems. And because it's a framework, it's sticking to those core features which are spelled out in those instruments. And then certainly there's going to be the context. If it's interventions, some interventions come with fidelity checks. Check in, check out has a fidelity check. CBITS, Cognitive Behavior Intervention for Trauma in Schools, has a fidelity check. Many interventions do not. And so then you have to come up with what is your plan. And so again, to me, this is a district decision with input from schools, coaches, leaders, team members, but you've got to come up with how are we going to check fidelity, whether that's of a teacher implementing a practice in their classroom or someone facilitating a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. You've got to have a way to check, did we do what we said we were going to do, right? Thank you. Anything else? 3 minutes. If we close now, you might get to the bathroom before everybody else. Yeah. Okay. You guys are awesome. Thank you. Have a good rest of your conference.